Check it out, in this video I'll be going over how to draw your own stipple fat cap tag with just a pen and paper. This was an immediate request by a ton of you guys after releasing my t-shirts last weekend, so I pushed some other videos back and made sure this was the next one I got up for you guys. So to start the process, we're going to need some fat caps to try and emulate. I'm sure 99% of you guys have seen a fat cap tag before, but the greatest part of a fat cap is obviously the flare that it's able to create, and the distance the can is off of the wall is what allows the cap to actually do that. When you have a fat cap nice and close to the canvas, it's going to actually give a pretty small line. In that small line, there's going to be a ton of extra paint though, so the closer you get, the faster a drip is going to be produced. As you move further away though, that same amount of paint is being sprayed onto the wall, but it's covering a much larger area. This allows you to get some really soft edges to lines and get that overall dusting effect that we're familiar with. And here with these 5 different steps, I'm taking the can a little bit further away from the wall to show how the size and overall shape of that circle changes. Now, a really common thing to do is to start off with a huge flare and then slowly bring the can closer to the wall, tapering it in and coming down to a nice cut point. It's definitely quite a bit harder to go in reverse when starting really small and trying to get it extra large, but the versatility here in size from the fat cap is what makes it so great. I'm sure many of you have the tag you want to use in mind for how you want to go about this tutorial. I'm going to be going with the letter A, so I could use some practice on the shape that I actually want to go after. I like the idea of a large top tapering down to some skinny legs, and then a tight curl going around the center. Can't say I draw A's too frequently, but a couple of these came out pretty good. You also want to be careful with what actual fat cap you're using. Fat caps like the Cyclone push out a ton of paint even if you are far away from the wall. So for these smaller size tags, they're going to give you a pretty much solid line throughout the entire thing. That's not totally desirable. In this case, the stipple effect works really well to show those lighter areas. So I'm also going to be using a gold dot, which is a softer fat cap. This will allow me to see some of those softer sections without having to go super large on the tag. But if you're working on a much larger scale, that Cyclone tip can give you even more diversity as far as what your largest line is and what your smallest one is. I also would like to get some single samples to show you guys how to draw just a single circle spray from a fat cap. So we'll be using the gold dot for that as well. Now we've got a solid starting point for our actual stipple design, so let's go inside and get some pen and paper. Be sure to spray that like button if you'd be interested in some more graffiti tutorials. Everybody seemed very excited last week when I mentioned this new tip, so I'm sure there's going to be plenty more techniques down the line that I'll be able to share with you guys. If you like the t-shirt I'm wearing, I released it last week with a lookbook, and it features the same technique on it. The link will be in the description of the video, and you can also check it out at sive.bigcartel.com. Now that we have some sample tags and flares to work off of, we're going to get to the drawing portion of this video. So for the drawing utensil, there's really only 2 things you need to look out for. First is something that's going to have a dark opacity on your page, give you something with some high contrast and really solid colors with each stipple, and then secondly, it's not going to bleed when you do press down. You want the size of each point to be consistent, as well as you don't want to have any variation in it being oblong or anything. You're going to want these to be really fine circles. The Sharpie pen worked great. If you have a stable hand, something like a Crayola or an alcohol marker would also work well, so long as the tip is nice and small. So a way to add value while using a single color is called a halftone, and stippling basically takes advantage of that. So as you have a higher density of dots in a certain area, it actually gives the effect of it being a darker shade. Halftones and perspective together can give you a really realistic image. So I'm going to start by making a 3-dimensional box and showing you how halftones can be used to show both shading on the sides as well as give you a little bit of depth. And this will be all without drawing solid lines. So now if we say our light source is coming from the right, we're going to slightly put this side of the box in a darker shadow. So by loading up a bunch of dots in this area, it's going to give a dark shaded effect to the side. Coloring this in totally black would cover pretty much the same idea, but you can see we almost have a light gray shade to this just because there's that little bit of white section your eyes are picking up on. And so to increase that idea, we're going to make this corner over here, which should be the darkest corner, extra dark with a bunch more dots. So the contrast is actually increasing on this side, and you're actually even being able to see a difference between those 2 sections. So now if you slowly lighten up how much you're actually increasing the darkness, you can almost get a gradient effect so that this section slowly gets darker into a lighter section. So now if we work on these other sides, I'm going to want this to be the lightest side, so I'm going to spread these dots out as much as I can while still covering it to give it a little bit of character. Then as far as the top goes, maybe we have that as a slightly lighter as well, so we'll just spread some dots out and then maybe make this back corner a little bit darker. One of the reasons I think flare tags look so good is they almost give a rounded look to a tag. It adds a little bit of a bevel shade down the middle and then lighter on the edges, so it looks like your tag's actually coming off the wall a little bit. Now with the tag, we're going to use a very similar premise, but build it up off the circle that tag actually creates with a single spray. So I'm going to try and mimic this single spray with just the stipple idea. So let's first start with that exterior shape of the circle that the cap has. The exterior line seems to taper down towards that one edge where it's pretty open, and then grow again outward back to the top. So let's add that kind of shape in there. Sometimes this circle can be a little bit more centered. It's really up to you how you want to draw it. I'm going to follow off this, and then we can also go through maybe at the end and show some other variations. So I'm going to work from darkest to lightest again, and we can see that there's a slightly darker side over on this edge of that inner circle. So I'm just going to load that up. And it also appears that this area on the top right is also the most dark compared to the other areas. Now I know I'm a big proponent of some rules that you set while you are making a drawing. So if you come in here and say this is your darkest section, then come up with maybe some intermediate areas that will be a stage 2 darkness all the way up to your lightest sections. So now, like I did on the other section, it definitely lightens up as I get down to here. So I'm going to keep it pretty heavy on the right side, and then as I go down, I'm going to lighten up so this exterior side might not ever get a little bit more. Then I'm also going to lighten up on the interior. So it's going to kind of give maybe a darker section flowing out all the way into this section over here. So to start that, I find that, set your darkest color up. In this case, we're going to load this section up to pretty much be black, and then slowly add a little bit more down the line. And then maybe start up a little bit lower, and slowly add a couple more. And then also not getting as close to this edge the next time around, so that you're kind of slowly going down to this corner a few times over, and you might extend further down, but you're not getting any closer to this edge. So there we have it. That side looks pretty good for now. Maybe a little bit lighter on this gradient, little splotches in there. And now I'm going to lighten up this section in here, because we have this hard circle in here, but there's still a little bit of spray making it into this center section, so I find it's always kind of nice to add a few more of those and darken the section up and see how it looks. Cool, definitely coming together. So now we're going to do a similar thing on this side. You can see that it's probably a little bit lighter than this section over here, so I might keep a gradient of about this size throughout this section. The circle's a good point to start because this is in theory what shape is drawn time and time again as you spray down a line. So this is a good idea to get a hold of what you're actually working with and how to get the circle to look nice, because those are going to be your end points, which will be pretty much the most crucial point of your letter. And now you don't have to keep all the way inside of this shape. You can add a couple extra little oversprays out and about to add some somewhat realistic imperfections to your stipple. If you find yourself a little unsure about it, take a pretty far step back and see what the overall shape looks like. If you get too kind of close up to it, it might be a little bit hard to see the shapes and the shading that you're going for. Let's give it a comparison to the original. The shape generally lines up. It's a pretty good comparison here. This fat cap shape is definitely not consistent between every cap. So the original fat cap stipple design I made for the t-shirts, I used a slightly different circle. This circle I used actually had an inner circle that also had another inner circle, so a little triad of circles that then stacked up on each other. That was one that I ended up spraying and liked how that looked on the ends of each of my lines. But it's really up to you and what you want to create. I'm sure you can get a handful of fat caps and a handful of different cans and try out what different styles you might be able to get, or totally model this off a tag you've already done. So I find it easiest now to trace the path that you would actually travel while making the tag. So for that A, kind of came down towards the left, came down a little bit farther to the right, had that extra extension over there, and then the swirl across the middle. So those are my three kind of paths that I would travel with the can. So spraying down, spraying over, spraying up, whatnot. So now based off that tag, we can start to show which areas are actually the larger and smaller sections. So we had a nice fat flare down at the end of this. So let's say the bottom section's a little larger flare, comes up to maybe a medium-sized flare, maybe a large flare down here as well, maybe a slightly smaller flare at the end of that line, and let's start working those in before we decide exactly where that line falls. So the distances from the canvas, like I showed before, are actually changing that line side. So as I get closer, I'm getting that smaller circle. From over here, I'm maybe far away from the canvas, and then as I travel past this line, I'm getting closer. So we have a slightly smaller circle there, so let's maybe do a mid-grade size circle here. And then you can almost attach these lines just as if it's following the same contour of a path. So that's going to give your slightly widening stance here, as well as following, the contour of the edge. This can be repurposed many times throughout the path, just as a slowly, increasing or slowly decreasing size of circles. So we can do the same thing here. Take the edge of this circle, try to match it up with that circle, as if we're following the center line. You can see the general shape of the A coming in there. And then lastly, this one, maybe we decide to move that a little bit further out so we can get a little bit more of that edge in there. So let's move the center of that circle over here, draw our small circle, kind of curve along this, and then curve along that interior. There we've got our little flare off to the side. And now with this larger section, I want this to be really tiny, kind of cut there, and then maybe this be a circle that just barely hits this edge. Should probably move that down if I want it to have a curl. So then here, the curl is going to follow much like that. We're going to have a pretty close edge over here, and then the inside is going to come up very short. And then following that over here, let's say we also want another curl. We want the interior of the curl to be right there, and maybe quickly get pretty large over here. If we want this to be an even larger area, we can make a larger circle a little bit further down. And then also following that contour, curl in, go around this edge, get a little bit fatter, and cut in. So within here, we might not need this information, but you can continue to follow that contour. So now let's darken up these edges so we can better see that overall A shape. Now this is a useful exercise when you're just designing letters as well. If you know the general shape of the letter you want to take, add some circular boxes in one way or another to kind of give you a little bit more style to the letter. Now we're pretty much ready to add the stipple to this contour and see how it kind of turns out. So I'm going to start by lightly tracing this onto another sheet. I'm also going to try and highlight those larger circle sections just so I have the shape ahead of time. I don't think I'll be needing the center lines, but it doesn't hurt, just pencil, I can erase them later. I'm going to follow this same circular shape. Started off with these two bottom sections. This should be identical to this circle for two reasons. This circle should exist both at the bottom of these two lines as well as in a higher concentration at this line. So since that one's a lot smaller, you might not actually see much of this white space. That could end up being just to be a solid black section. But especially here, since it's only being covered once, it could potentially have that very light airy section and look just like the end of a fat cat flare. So I'll start there and redo it, and then we can work up this section and see how other areas are going to work in. Okay, so now following this high density section, this center line is actually going to be pretty dark throughout this line, and then we can see either exterior edge is also going to be pretty dark, where it's already solid even just with the light spray. The more open section, however, is going to exist here in between those two hard sections, and we're going to have a slightly lighter area. So let's start with the hard black edges, and then work in some of that lighter mixing in there. A quick note before we get here, we're actually going to be spending twice as much time when spraying in this circle, so you can think about it as being twice as dark as this single spray. That is because we're coming up once with this line, and then also down with this line. So if we want to keep that bottom edge as the lighter, this top section is actually going to be pretty dark, so we can just fill in a rough shape of it before continuing. And maybe have this mid section here that was pretty spread out, more dense because it's smaller and we're passing over it twice. The darker sections will also become darker, and if it's a small enough section, the area will end up being totally black. The top circle looks good for reference, so now let's go in and work in the center section. So you can work up from the edges, making it slightly less dense as you get further away from the edge, and then from the center line do the exact opposite. I'm going to fill in now the lightest of lights, and you can kind of see we're getting that nice gradient effect. I like to define the edge of my circle a little extra, even though it's not necessarily like that in real life. It allows you to see that initial circle a little bit better. So now, since there's multiple layups of this circle just past the original line, it gets a little bit denser just as it starts moving, and then maybe you get going fast enough and it lightens up again. These are all artistic decisions of how realistic you want this stipple to actually be. Now I'm going to do pretty much the identical thing on the other side. There might be a couple areas here I can touch up later, but I like to move on and get the whole thing down, and then go back in and work on some specific sections. So I'm basically going to repeat the same process here, and then I'll be able to get into some unique stuff where these lines actually overlap. So now that we have these two sections here that actually are overlapping a little bit more than just the circle up top, you're going to actually want to draw some of that information in. So if we take this curve down here, we're going to have a solid dotted line passes over top of that first down stem. And since that line is actually going to be covered twice, the transparency here is going to be a lot darker. So let's just add a little bit more stipple there. I'm definitely leaving a little bit available so that there's almost maybe two layers visible, but you can get the doubled up effect and it looks pretty nice. And now by all means you can go right into this step, you don't have to actually draw each thing individually, but I think it's good practice and it gets you a nice accurate representation of what doubling up actually might look like. Now let's follow a very similar process going over top of the swirl. Once again, I'm going to keep that center line in there and darken the edges a little bit more than that midsection. We're on the home stretch here, so I'm just going to finish out the contours. While keeping in mind the very small sections are going to be a lot darker than some of the open flared sections. So over here, even though these are the same size, the interior here is going to be far less transparent than the outside here because it's going to wash out and open up a little bit more on that flare. So it probably won't make that edge much darker than it already is. The stipple's pretty much finished up at this point. Now I'm going to go through, correct some little areas that could use a little bit of work, but it's pretty much done. I'm adding some additional contrast into these interior sections, much like on this curl, so it adds a little bit of depth that the inside of this is getting a little bit less light than these exterior sides. So there we have a Stipple A, all done by hand, modeled after a little bit of spray painting I did this afternoon. This is a really fun method to try. I think the results come out really clean when you give it a little bit of extra time. I'm really happy with this, and I hope that you guys can learn how to do it just as easily as I was. I've probably done 10 or 12 of these at this point, but with the pretty streamlined process, it shouldn't be that hard to learn. And not to mention the fact that you can really use any supplies while making this makes this an awesome tutorial for you guys to get out and try yourselves. I hope all the steps were pretty clear and concise, but if you ever have any questions, feel free to hit me in the comment section down below. I'll read through all of them and make sure to get back to anybody that needs some extra help. If you want to send some of your stipple work my way, be sure to use the hashtag Stipple Graffiti or Stipple Tag on Instagram. Strangely enough, while I was posting videos of the t-shirts from last weekend on Instagram, I found that that was the first occurrence while using those two hashtags. For at least a little while, it'll be a nice area to check out mine and maybe some other people's work. So like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, I am selling t-shirts featuring the all-over print and single designs on my big cartel. That link will be in the description of the video, and a link to the video where I show off the process of actually making them myself, as well as a lookbook of the t-shirts. I'm really proud of how that came out. If you enjoyed the tutorial and were able to take some helpful information away, please feel free to spray that like button. It helps to share the video on YouTube so other people will be able to find it when they search. Also consider joining the crew by subscribing. I post weekly graffiti related videos as far as tutorials or reviews, or maybe even that lookbook like I mentioned last week. On screen right now you'll find some of those videos I mentioned, as well as all their links will be in the description of the video. There's also a quick link to that web store if you're interested in purchasing one of the t-shirts that was featured. The support on those goes an extra long way. Thank you once again. That's going to do it for me, guys. Peace.